The thick green forests of northern Michigan had always seemed safe, timeless, untouched by the ugliness of the world. In 1968, the community of Good Hart was small, tucked against the shores of Lake Michigan, a place where people came to disappear into nature for a few weeks each year. Summer cabins stood in clusters along dirt roads, and the sound of waves hitting the shoreline was constant background music. Families would retreat there, away from Detroit, away from the endless grind of cities, to find quiet in the shade of pines and birches. For Richard Robison and his family, Good Hart was not just a vacation, it was a tradition, an escape that had become part of their lives. But that summer, a darkness moved silently among the trees, and the stillness that once brought peace would become the backdrop for a tragedy unlike anything the state of Michigan had ever seen. Richard Robison was 42 years old, the kind of man who appeared to have everything. He owned an advertising business, interior advertising, and had built it from determination and shrewd choices. He had the demeanor of a businessman who knew how to charm a client, close a deal, and hide his frustrations behind a practiced smile. He wasn't wealthy in the way millionaires were, but he lived comfortably in Detroit with his wife Shirley and their 4 children. His work often pulled him in multiple directions, yet he craved the slower pace of the family cabin, where his days were no longer dictated by meetings or contracts. At the cabin, he could sit outside, listen to the wind through the leaves, and watch his children play. For Richard, it was the one place where life felt uncomplicated. His wife Shirley was 40, soft-spoken and deeply devoted to her family. Unlike her husband, she wasn't driven by business or ambition, but by the happiness of her children. She had a calming influence, someone who knew how to ground Richard's energy and keep the household stable. Their children brought life to the cabin. Richie, 19, was on the edge of manhood, but still carried the boyish loyalty of an eldest son. Gary, 17, was restless, curious, and eager to test his independence. Randy, 12, was mischievous and playful, still young enough to cling to childhood, while 7-year-old Susan was the heart of the family, adored and protected by everyone. To outsiders, they were a picture of mid-century America, a hard-working father, a supportive mother, and children growing up in the relative safety of the suburbs. Yet even families that look perfect from the outside often carry shadows. Richard's business, though successful, was under pressure. The advertising industry was competitive, and the man he trusted most in his company, Joseph "Joe" Scolaro III, had begun to show signs of failure. Scolaro was 30, confident and convincing, the kind of man who could walk into a room and talk his way into trust. Richard had given him responsibility over financial matters, and with that came access to funds, accounts, and clients. But Scolaro was drowning in debts, both personal and professional. He had begun siphoning money, cutting corners, and lying to keep himself afloat. For months, Richard had overlooked the warning signs. Perhaps he believed Joe could turn things around, or perhaps he simply didn't want to face the reality that the man he trusted most in his company was betraying him. By the time he began asking questions, Scolaro's lies were already layered too deep to unravel easily. As June arrived, the Robisons packed up for Good Hart. Their cabin in Blisswood Resort was modest, a wooden structure surrounded by thick trees, with just enough space for the 6 of them. They settled in, carrying with them groceries, board games, and the simple comforts that turned a cabin into a second home. Neighbors saw them coming and going. There was laughter, the hum of an engine as Richard drove into town for errands, the shouts of children playing outside. It was normal, ordinary, unremarkable. No one could have imagined that within weeks, their cabin would become a sealed tomb. The Robisons lived quietly during those last days. They weren't the type of family to invite others in often. They kept to themselves, enjoying their time away. But there were hints, small, almost invisible threads, that Richard's business troubles had followed him north. Letters, phone calls, notes, left half-written. He was trying to untangle Scolaro's financial mess, even while surrounded by his children. Business and family overlapped in ways that made the boundaries unclear, and though the cabin was meant to be a retreat, the tension lingered in Richard's mind. On June 25, 1968, something terrible happened inside that wooden cabin. The details, even reconstructed later, remain clouded by mystery. What is known is this: sometime that day, someone entered their home armed with a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle and a .22 caliber handgun. Richard was shot first, struck multiple times with bullets that ended his life violently. Shirley and the children were not spared. Each one was executed with cold precision, though investigators later believed that some had also been bludgeoned, as if the killer's rage had spilled beyond bullets. The violence was not random. It carried intention, anger, and familiarity. The killer tried to make it look like a robbery. Drawers were disturbed, items scattered, but money remained untouched. Valuables sat where they always had. To the trained eye, it was clear the scene was staged. Whoever had done this had wanted to mislead police, to throw suspicion away from the truth. And then, as quietly as they had come, the killer left, locking the silence of death inside the walls of the cabin. Days passed. The woods remained quiet. Mail piled up at the Robisons' Detroit home. Grass outside their summer cabin grew taller. To neighbors, nothing seemed unusual at first. In a resort community, cabins often went dark for days or weeks, families leaving suddenly or spending time elsewhere. Silence was normal, and yet, silence can be deceptive. As June turned into July, a terrible odor began to drift from the cabin. At first, it was faint, carried by the wind, mistaken for the smell of animals in the heat, but soon it grew stronger, thicker, impossible to ignore. Flies gathered against the cabin's windows in buzzing clusters. By July 22, nearly a month after the family had been killed, the neighbors could no longer dismiss it. Something was wrong, very wrong. When authorities arrived, they approached the cabin cautiously. The door creaked open, and what awaited them inside was beyond imagination. The air was heavy with decay, a suffocating stench that made even seasoned investigators gag. The interior was dark, hot, and swarming with insects. And there, inside, lay the decomposed bodies of 6 people, the Robison family. The scene was grotesque. Weeks of summer heat had left the remains bloated and barely recognizable. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered, as if frozen in the aftermath of chaos. The officers had seen death before, but never like this. It was not only the horror of the bodies, but the knowledge that 6 lives, a whole family, had been extinguished in a single act of violence. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. The quiet community of Good Hart was thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters descended, neighbors whispered, and fear grew. Who could have done such a thing? Why? The Robisons were not known to have enemies in town. They were private, but not secretive. To the outside world, there was no reason for such brutality. And yet, someone had carried it out with precision and purpose. As investigators began piecing together the evidence, the picture became clearer. The bullets matched weapons that had once been owned by none other than Joseph Scolaro. He had motive, embezzlement, fraud, the fear of being exposed by Richard. He had opportunity, and he had no solid alibi. His fingerprints were metaphorically all over the case, yet frustratingly absent in the way the law required. Without the actual murder weapons, without a confession, it was circumstantial, strong, damning, but not airtight. Still, investigators were convinced. For them, the trail led straight back to Scolaro. The question was not if he was guilty, but whether they could ever prove it beyond doubt. In the meantime, the Robisons were buried, 6 coffins lowered into the ground, 6 lives cut short. Their relatives mourned in disbelief. Their neighbors in Good Hart struggled to sleep at night, and Michigan carried the weight of a massacre that made no sense. And yet, as the caskets were lowered and prayers were whispered, one question lingered in the heavy silence. Why had no one heard? Why had no one seen? How had a family of 6 been murdered in their summer cabin, without a single cry, without a single neighbor noticing movement in or out. The answers, investigators believed, lay in the hands of one man, and though the suspicion grew, though the evidence stacked higher and higher, he walked freely, his smile unchanged, his lies polished, his guilt unproven. The Robison murders had been discovered, but the story was only just beginning. The Robison family cabin was no longer just another quiet summer home tucked away in the Michigan woods. By the end of July 1968, it had become the site of one of the most horrifying crimes the state had ever seen. When law enforcement officers stepped out of that cabin after the discovery, they carried with them the stench of death, the sight of unimaginable violence, and the responsibility of finding answers for 6 lives that had been stolen. The news spread across Emmett County almost instant. In communities like Good Hart, where neighbors knew each other's names and families trusted one another, the murder of an entire family was beyond comprehension. People locked their doors, something rarely done before in a place like that. They watched strangers with suspicion. Parents kept their children closer. A quiet dread settled in, because if 6 people could be killed so brutally without a sound, then perhaps no one was safe. Investigators sealed off the Robison cabin, moving carefully through the interior despite the unbearable condition. The bodies had been decomposing for nearly a month. In the summer heat, forensic science in 1968 was nowhere near what it would become decades later, but the officers did their best to document every detail. The layout of the cabin showed chaos, but it was a chaos that didn't quite make sense. Yes, drawers had been opened and items knocked over, but valuables were untouched. Cash was still there, jewelry had not been taken, and nothing obvious suggested that robbery had been the motive. To trained eyes, it looked staged, deliberately disorganized, as if someone wanted investigators to believe it was a break-in gone wrong. But the precision of the killings told another story. Richard's body showed multiple gunshot wounds, more than the other. It was as though the killer had reserved special rage for him. Shirley's body lay nearby, her wounds suggesting she had been shot quickly, but also struck afterward, bludgeoned with force that seemed unnecessary. If the bullets had already killed her, the children too were not spared. Each one bore marks of bullets fired from 2 distinct weapons, a .22 caliber rifle and a .25 caliber handgun. That detail was crucial. It suggested premeditation, that the killer had come armed with 2 guns, or perhaps even that more than one person was involved. But when investigators compared the bullet fragments and casings, they realized something chilling. The weapons used were both linked to firearms that had once belonged to a man in Richard's business circle. The name surfaced quickly: Joseph Scolaro. To detectives piecing together the fragments of Richard's professional life, it was impossible to ignore him. Scolaro was not just an employee, he was a close associate, someone Richard had trusted deeply with the finances of interior advertising. But as they dug into records and correspondence, a troubling picture emerged. Money was missing from accounts, thousands of dollars had vanished, and Richard had started to catch on before the murder. Notes in Richard's files suggested he was preparing to confront Scolaro, to demand explanations for the irregularities. That gave Scolaro both motive and desperation. If Richard exposed him, his career, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom would collapse. Detectives also uncovered an important fact. Scolaro owned firearms that matched the calibers used in the murders. He had purchased a .22 caliber Armalite semi-automatic rifle and a .20. Ballistics tests showed the bullets taken from the Robison bodies were consistent with those types of weapons. It was a direct link, one that narrowed the list of suspects dramatically. But when police questioned him, Scolaro claimed he no longer had those guns. He said they had gone missing, stolen or misplaced. Without the weapons themselves, prosecutors knew it would be difficult to make an airtight case. Still, the suspicion grew heavy. As the weeks turned into months, investigators began to focus nearly all their energy on him. They visited his home, interviewed his acquaintances, traced his financial records, and checked his whereabouts during the week of June 25. His alibi was shaky. He claimed he had been busy with work and personal errands, but gaps in his timeline left unanswered questions.
Phone records didn't align with his statements. Witnesses contradicted parts of his story. To many in law enforcement, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, and yet, it remained circumstantial. The press described the crime as a massacre, a bloodbath, that defied explanation. Photographs of the cabin appeared alongside headlines speculating about motives. Some reporters suggested it had been a mob-style execution, the work of organized crime. Others whispered about jealousies or secret affairs. In the absence of charges, theories multiplied. What seemed clear was that Richard had been the primary target. The excessive violence directed at him, compared to the others, hinted at personal animosity. The rest of the family, investigators believed, had been killed simply because they were witnesses. Inside the police files, though, the focus never strayed far from Scolaro. Detectives noted inconsistencies in his statement. At one point, he admitted to lying about his whereabouts, changing small details once confronted. When asked about his guns, he became defensive. He insisted he was innocent, that he had no reason to hurt the Robison. But when investigators pressed harder about the missing money at interior advertising, he grew evasive. Richard had been preparing to sever ties with him, perhaps even report him. For a man already drowning in debt, the threat of exposure could have been enough to push him over the edge. But without the murder weapons, prosecutors were hesitant. They needed something undeniable, something that could stand in court. And as the case lingered, time worked against them. Leads grew cold, witnesses forgot details, and evidence decayed. The Robison murders began to slide toward the status of a cold case, even though everyone involved seemed convinced they knew who was responsible. For the families of Shirley and Richard, the lack of justice was unbearable. They had buried 6 coffins, mourned 6 lives, and yet, the man they believed had destroyed them walked freely. Every holiday, every birthday, every memory of Susan, Randy, Gary and Richie brought pain without closure. They read the newspapers, watched the investigators try and fail to build a case, and wondered if the truth would ever be acknowledged in a courtroom. Outwardly, he maintained his innocence, running his affairs, moving through society as though the cloud above him didn't exist. But those who knew him closely said he seemed changed, nervous, irritable, always carrying the weight of something unspoken. Guilt has a way of seeping out, even in silence. For the investigators still working the case, it was maddening. They had bullets, ballistics, motive, opportunity, and financial records pointing to fraud. They had testimony that contradicted his alibi. They had everything but the weapons and a confession. And in 1968, without DNA technology or the kind of forensic breakthroughs available today, that gap was enough to keep prosecutors from filing charges. The Robison murders remained officially unsolved, even as whispers in every bar, every coffee shop, and every neighborhood pointed to the same man. Years later, one detective would admit that they had been certain beyond doubt of his guilt. They could feel it in their bones, see it in the evidence, hear it in his lies. But the law required more than certainty. It required proof, and proof was what they didn't have. The story did not end there. The murders hung over the town of Good Hart like a storm cloud. Families who once felt safe in their cabins now looked at their neighbors with suspicion. Parents told their children never to wander far. Not anymore. Not after what had happened to the Robison. Each summer when people returned to their cabins, they passed by the Robison place and remembered the smell, the flies, the horror of that discovery. The cabin itself became a dark landmark, a reminder of innocence lost. But as the 60s gave way to the 70s, the case continued to smolder. Investigators reopened files, re-examined evidence, and returned to Scolaro again and again. They pressed him with questions, hoping he might slip, hoping his guilt might show itself in a way that could be used in court. They searched for the missing guns, followed tips that claimed to know where they had gone, and yet each lead dissolved into nothing. The frustration was palpable. For the surviving relatives of the Robison family, there was no resolution. They carried their grief quietly, hoping against hope that someday, somehow, justice would be served. And though they rarely spoke to the press, the pain was visible in their silence. They had lost, not just parents and siblings, but the future itself. The graduations that would never happen, the weddings that would never be celebrated, the grandchildren who would never be born, and for Joseph Scolaro, the shadow never left. He could deny it to investigators, he could deny it to the press, but he could never escape the suspicion. It clung to him, followed him, became part of his identity. Every business deal, every personal relationship, every step he took, was haunted by whispers of Good Hart. People stared when he entered rooms, they lowered their voices when he passed by. He lived free, but never free of suspicion. The Robison family murders had transformed from a shocking act of violence into a haunting mystery. The evidence pointed one way, but the law demanded more than evidence. It demanded certainty, and until that certainty was found, the case would remain in limbo, neither solved nor forgotten. But time has a way of uncovering truths, and guilt has a way of breaking even the strongest facade. The story of the Robisons was not finished. The pieces were still scattered, waiting to fall into place, and while the community of Good Hart tried to move forward, the killer, known or unknown, still walked among them, carrying a burden that no one else could see but everyone else could feel.
The murder of the Robison family was no longer just a crime scene sealed inside a cabin. It had become a weight pressing on every investigator, every surviving relative, and every newspaper that still carried the story years later. As the 60s faded into the 70s, the case remained officially unsolved, but unofficially, the suspicion grew heavier and heavier against one man. Joseph Scolaro could smile. He could deny, he could build walls of excuses, but no amount of words could erase the fact that the evidence always circled back to him. It was as if every path investigators walked down ended with his name scratched into the dirt. The investigators who had first walked into the Robison cabin in July of 1968 carried the images with them for the rest of their careers. They remembered the heat, the smell of decay, the sight of 6 lives ended brutally, and they remembered the evidence. The casings, the bullet fragments, the signs of staging. Each time they reviewed their files, each time they studied the photographs, their focus returned to the same details. Richard had been shot with excessive violence, more than what was necessary to kill. That pointed to anger, to betrayal, to someone who had reason to hate him. The rest of the family, Shirley, Richie, Gary, Randy, and little Susan, had been killed not because of anger, but because they were there, witnesses who could not be left alive. It was not random. It was not opportunistic. It was deliberate. In Detroit, Scolaro lived in the shadow of suspicion. He continued to insist he was innocent, yet the inconsistencies in his story gnawed at the investigators who interviewed him again and again. His alibi for the days surrounding June 25 was full of holes. He claimed to have been busy with errands and business, but when police checked with those he said he had seen, the details didn't match. He told them his guns had been stolen, yet there were no reports of theft filed before the murders, only after investigators began asking about them. When ballistics experts compared the bullets from the cabin to test firings from similar models of firearms, they could say with confidence that the weapons once owned by Scolaro were consistent. The only missing piece was the physical guns themselves. Without them, there would always be doubt. The prosecutors knew the risks. To charge him without those weapons was to gamble everything on circumstantial evidence. If a jury acquitted him, the case could never be retried. That was the law. So they waited, hoping for a break, hoping the missing guns would surface, hoping for a confession that might slip in a weak moment. But year after year, the case remained stagnant. For the Robison's surviving relatives, it was agony. They wanted closure, but closure never came. Holidays passed with empty chairs. Anniversaries came with silent grief. Each newspaper article that described the case as unsolved felt like a wound being reopened. Meanwhile, the press fed on the mystery. True crime was beginning to capture public imagination, and the Robison family murders were the perfect storm of horror and intrigue. Reporters speculated about mafia ties, about business rivalries, about lovers' quarrels, anything that might explain the savagery. But among law enforcement circles, the focus never shifted. They knew who had the motive. They knew who had the opportunity. They knew who had lied. It was always Joe. Scolaro himself lived as though he were too many. To the world he was a businessman trying to carry on, maintaining an image of respectability, but behind closed doors the pressure was eroding him. Investigators described him as defensive, irritable and at times arrogant during questioning. He insisted the evidence was circumstantial, that no one could prove anything, and he wasn't wrong. Yet the very need to defend himself so often betrayed the fear that lived beneath his words. He knew the walls were closing in, even if slow. The police reports from those years tell a story of persistence. Detectives knocked on doors, retraced steps, followed rumors. They looked for the missing guns everywhere. Pawn shops, private collections, buried caches in the woods, but nothing surfaced. Whoever had killed the Robisons had hidden them well, or destroyed them entirely. Every lead that promised a breakthrough collapsed into disappointment, and with each disappointment, the case grew colder, the trail weaker, but investigators refused to let it go. For them, the Robisons weren't just names on a file, they were a family. They were faces in photographs, children whose futures had been stolen, parents who had tried to give them a summer of peace. That sense of duty kept the case alive, even when the public began to forget. Even when new crimes took the spotlight, there were always detectives in Michigan who kept the Robisons in their minds, waiting for the day the truth could finally be nailed down. By 1973, nearly 5 years after the murders, the case reached a breaking point. Prosecutors had grown weary of waiting for a miracle. They prepared to take the case against Scolaro to the next step. Evidence files had been thickened with reports of embezzlement, fraud, and the clear financial motive he had to silence. Richard. Witnesses had been re-interviewed. Timelines had been reconstructed. The case was circumstantial, yes, but it was strong. It was enough to move forward. Investigators were certain that within weeks, formal charges would be filed against him, but Joseph Scolaro never gave them the chance. On March 8, 1973, Scolaro was found dead in his office. He had taken his own life with a gunshot, leaving behind 2 suicide notes. One was addressed to his mother, apologizing for the pain he had caused her. The other was addressed to his attorney, in which he admitted to financial wrongdoing, acknowledged his failures, and expressed remorse for the lies he had told. But in both letters, he denied any involvement in the Robison murders. "I had nothing to do with the Good Hart case," he wrote. "I am a liar, a cheat, but not a murderer." The suicide shocked investigators, but it also enraged them. They had been so close to bringing him to court, so close to presenting their evidence to a jury. Now, with his death, the chance was gone forever. The case would remain officially unsolved, and the Robison family would never see justice in the courtroom. To many detectives, the suicide was as good as a confession. Even if the note said otherwise, he had known the charges were coming. He had known the weight of evidence was too strong. Rather than face trial, he had ended his life, leaving behind ambiguity that would torture the case forever. For the Robisons' relatives, the news brought no comfort. There was no trial, no conviction, no closure, just another death, layered onto the tragedy. Scolaro had escaped in the only way he knew how, and the families were left with unanswered questions. If he was innocent, why had he lied so often? Why had he hidden his weapons? Why had he killed himself just as charges were being prepared? And if he was guilty, why had he not admitted it before the end? The truth lay buried with him, locked away forever. In the years that followed, the Robison murders became one of Michigan's most infamous cold cases. Books were written, articles published, documentaries produced, each one circling the same question: who killed the Robisons? For most who studied the evidence, the answer seemed obvious. It was Scolaro, but without a conviction, the case remained in the uneasy category of unsolved. It was a wound that never fully closed, a story that never truly ended. Even decades later, people still drove past the site of the Robison cabin, whispering about the tragedy. Some swore the land carried a heaviness, that the woods around it felt different, as if they remembered. For those who had lived in Good Hart at the time, the memory never faded. They remembered the smell, the flies, the police cars, the headlines. They remembered the way fear changed their town forever. And for the surviving family members,
The grief never lessened. They carried it quietly, privately, through the years. 6 voices, silenced in 1968. 6 lives that could never be replaced. No conviction, no trial, no confession could ever bring them back. The only legacy left was a mystery, one that stood as a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how sometimes, even when the truth seems clear, justice can slip away. But some investigators never let go. Long after Scolaro's death, long after the files were stamped and stored, they still spoke of the Robisons. They still wondered if somewhere, hidden away in a basement, a field, or a forgotten storage unit, the missing weapons might still exist. They wondered if someday, someone would stumble upon them, and at last, the final piece of the puzzle would click into place. Until then, the case lived in limbo, half closed, half open, always waiting. The Robison murders were more than a tragedy. They were a story of betrayal, of trust broken, of a family destroyed not by strangers but by someone who had been close. And they were a reminder that the darkest truths often hide behind the most familiar faces. The investigation into the Robison family murders had dragged on through the summer of 1968, into the chill of autumn, and yet no arrests had been made. In Emmett County, the shock of the crime was still palpable. People who had once left their cabins unlocked began to install extra locks. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and the town of Good Hart no longer felt like the safe, hidden paradise it once was. But for investigators, the crime scene still spoke in whispers rather than declaration. What little evidence had been collected pointed toward one name over and over again: Joseph Scolaro III. Yet the evidence, while suggestive, was not the kind that could hold up under the scrutiny of a trial. That tension between knowing and proving haunted everyone involved in the case. The autopsies had already confirmed the sheer brutality of the killings. Richard Robison had been shot multiple times, both with a .22 caliber weapon and a .20. His wife Shirley and their children had also been killed with a combination of gunshots and bludgeoning, making the crime seem both methodical and frenzied. The fact that 2 separate calibers of bullets had been used suggested that the killer either carried 2 weapons or had staged the crime with calculated intent. When investigators dug into Richard's life, they discovered what many successful businessmen eventually accumulate: a network of people who admired him, and a smaller, but dangerous number, who resented him. Yet among all of these figures, no one seemed to have the same clear motive, or the same proximity as Scolaro. Detectives began to piece together a timeline. The Robison family had last been seen alive on June. Neighbors reported seeing them that afternoon, perhaps running errands or relaxing near the cabin. After that, silence. The mail piled up, newspapers collected near the door. By July 22, when a neighbor finally noticed the stench and contacted police, nearly a month had passed. That gap in time became a problem almost immediately. With decomposition advanced, it was difficult to establish the precise date of death. Estimates placed the murders somewhere around June 25, but without precision. Investigators struggled to nail down alibis. For Scolaro, that uncertainty gave him wiggle room. He claimed to have been working in Detroit at the time, juggling both his role at interior advertising and personal matters, but the lack of detailed records made it difficult to contradict him definitively. Still, the circumstantial evidence piled higher. Ballistics tests showed that the bullets matched the kind of ammunition used in weapons that Scolaro had once owned. He had purchased both a .22 caliber AR-7 semi-automatic rifle and a .25 caliber Beretta pistol in the past. When police asked about them, he admitted that he had bought such weapons, but claimed they were no longer in his possession. One, he said, had been sold, the other, misplaced. Investigators found his explanations evasive and troubling. They had no murder weapons to compare definitively, but the connection was far too close for comfort. Then there was the financial trail. Richard Robison had begun to notice irregularities in his company's books. Before his death, he trusted Scolaro, but doubts had been creeping. As police pored over interior advertising's records, they uncovered tens of thousands of dollars missing from accounts. Scolaro's fingerprints were all over these discrepancies. Investigators theorized that Richard may have confronted him, perhaps threatening to expose or fire him. If that were true, then Scolaro not only had motive, but desperation, a man drowning in debt, facing professional ruin, and cornered by the truth, might lash out violently, but proving this was another matter. Embezzlement cases left paper trails, but translating that into direct evidence of murder was a leap. Detectives visited Scolaro repeatedly in the months following the murders. At first, he cooperated, answering questions and trying to appear calm, but cracks began to show. He contradicted himself in small ways, gave vague details about his whereabouts, and seemed increasingly agitated when pressed about the missing weapon. On one occasion, he even admitted to lying about certain aspects of his timeline, though he continued to deny any involvement in the murders themselves. For investigators, this was maddening. They were certain they had their man, but without a confession or the weapons, the case remained shaky. Meanwhile, the media kept the pressure alive. The Robison murders became headline news across Michigan and beyond. The brutality of the crime, combined with the image of an innocent family wiped out in their summer retreat, captured the public imagination. Journalists speculated about mob connections, family disputes, or even random acts of violence by drifters. Some newspapers leaned heavily on the theory that Richard's business dealings had backfired. Others hinted at a more sinister conspiracy, with Richard's role as a publisher of a small arts magazine, suggesting that he might have had enemies in unexpected places. For every fact investigators revealed, rumors multiplied. Shirley's extended family, devastated by the loss, pressed authorities for answers. They believed that justice was being delayed unnecessarily, that Scolaro should have already been charged. For them, the evidence was more than enough, but prosecutors were cautious. They knew that taking the case to trial without the murder weapons, or a confession, risked an acquittal, which would close the door forever. They preferred to keep investigating, hoping for that one break that would turn suspicion into certainty. That break, however, never seemed to come. Months turned into years. Each time investigators circled back to Scolaro, they found the same frustrating pattern: compelling circumstantial evidence, but no smoking gun. They looked into other suspects, but none fit as neat. There were no signs of forced entry at the cabin, no indication that the family had been targeted by strangers. Whoever committed the crime had likely been let inside, or at least approached without raising alarm. That pointed back to someone the family knew, and Scolaro fit that profile perfectly. Yet there were odd details that continued to nag at detectives. Why had two weapons been used? Why had some victims been bludgeoned as well as If this was purely about silencing Richard, why kill the entire family? Was it to eliminate witnesses, or had rage taken over, turning a calculated act into a massacre? These questions gnawed at the edges of the case, making it more complex than a simple narrative of financial betrayal. The community of Good Hart tried to move on, but the shadow of the murders lingered. The Blisswood cabins, once symbols of summer joy, became reminders of horror. Some families sold their properties, unable to reconcile the image of children playing in the woods, with the knowledge that 6 innocent people had been slaughtered nearby. Others stayed, determined not to let fear drive them away. But everyone knew the Robison cabin. Everyone knew the story. By 1969, the investigation had reached a standstill. Without new evidence, prosecutors hesitated. Scolaro remained free, though he lived under a cloud of suspicion that never lifted. He continued to work, to maintain some semblance of normal life, but those who knew him said he grew more withdrawn, more bitter. Investigators, too, carried their frustration. They had files full of notes, interviews, and theories, but the case remained unresolved. And yet in the background, small details continued to surface. Handwriting analysis suggested that Scolaro may have forged documents in the company's financial records. Witnesses reported seeing him near the time of the murders, though none could pin him down exactly. When questioned about his weapons, his stories shifted again. Each new inconsistencies added weight to the suspicion, but still not enough to tip the balance toward indictment. For the Robisons' relatives, this was unbearable. They attended memorials, visited graves, and kept asking themselves why. Why would someone kill an entire family? Why did the system seem powerless to deliver justice? Every holiday that passed without resolution was another reminder of what had been taken from them. For the children's friends, too, The memory of the murders lingered. Randy and Susan should have grown up, graduated, fallen in love, lived their lives. Instead, their names were etched in obituaries and police files. The authorities never closed the case. But as the 1970s began, hope dimmed. Cold cases were not unusual, but this one carried an especially heavy weight. Everyone believed they knew the killer. Everyone believed Scolaro's guilt, but belief was not enough. Evidence mattered, and evidence was missing. For detectives, who had devoted themselves to the case, it was a professional and personal defeat. For the community, it was a reminder that evil can sometimes escape justice, no matter how obvious it appears. And yet the story was not finished. The Robison murders remained an open wound, and the name Joseph Scolaro lingered like a ghost in the files. The years ahead would see new developments, tragic turns, and revelations that would ensure the case would never be forgotten. The Robisons were gone, but their story was far from over.
The turn of the decade did nothing to ease the burden of the Robison family murders. As 1970 approached, detectives who had pored over the gruesome case for years carried the same frustration they had felt from the very beginning. They had a suspect, they had motive, they had circumstantial evidence strong enough to sway anyone in casual conversation, but they lacked the pieces that would hold up in court. The Emmett County Sheriff's Department and the Michigan State Police still kept the files open, but the case was already beginning to drift into the kind of haunting limbo that swallows so many unsolved homicides. In the center of it all remained Joseph "Joe" Scolaro, the advertising executive who had gone from trusted business associate to the only real suspect in one of Michigan's most horrifying mass killings. By now, the public had grown accustomed to hearing his name whispered alongside that of the Robison family. Neighbors in Detroit, where he lived, regarded him with suspicion. Business associates distanced themselves. Even without a trial, guilt clung to him. The weight of suspicion was like a constant shadow he could not shake. Yet legally, he remained a free man. No indictment had been brought. Prosecutors had judged the case too fragile to survive cross-examination in a courtroom. Without the missing murder weapons or definitive forensic evidence, it was simply too risky. The fear was always the same. If Scolaro were tried and acquitted, double jeopardy would prevent them from ever trying him again, even if new evidence surfaced. But the authorities never stopped circling him. Detectives from multiple agencies kept returning to his doorstep, kept pulling at the same threads, hoping one would finally unravel the truth. They pressed him about the financial discrepancies at Interior Advertising. They grilled him about the weapons. They revisited his alibi for late June 1968, challenging him on inconsistencies, and every time, Scolaro gave answers that seemed more evasive than the last. He admitted to lying about certain details of his schedule during that week, but claimed the lies were trivial, designed only to protect his privacy. He insisted he had not killed anyone. The forensic evidence, such as it was, remained both tantalizing and frustrating. Ballistics experts confirmed that the bullets pulled from the Robisons' bodies were consistent with the type of ammunition used in guns Scolaro had once purchased, but consistent with was not identical to. Without the actual firearms, certainty was impossible. Investigators scoured pawn shops, gun dealers and acquaintances, searching for any trace of those missing weapons. They never surfaced. Scolaro's explanation, that he had lost one gun and sold the other, never rang true, but it also could not be disproved. In a criminal court, doubt was enough to unravel an entire case. The 1970s dawned, and with them came new pressures. In Detroit, the economy was shifting, and Scolaro's once promising career was faltering. Interior Advertising, already rocked by the discovery of embezzlement after Richard Robison's death, collapsed. Scolaro scrambled to maintain some semblance of professional respectability, but the weight of his reputation made that nearly impossible. Clients knew his name from the headlines. Colleagues whispered. He grew more isolated, more irritable, and more defensive. Those who interacted with him in business
described a man who seemed perpetually on edge, a man haunted by something he could never quite escape. For investigators, his crumbling world only deepened their conviction. They believed the murders had been driven by desperation, financial pressure, fear of exposure, and a sense of betrayal by Richard Robison, and yet they could not move forward. For years prosecutors stalled, waiting for new evidence. They hoped that a witness would come forward, or that a break in the financial investigation would tie everything together. But silence stretched on. The Robison murders remained unsolved, the cabin where the family had been slaughtered, standing like a ghostly monument to violence and failure. The Robison family's relatives endured this limbo with anguish. They believed that justice had been delayed long enough. For them it was not about perfect evidence. It was about what was right. They wanted charges brought, even if the risk of acquittal lay. To them, letting Scolaro walk free while suspicion weighed heavily was a greater injustice than taking the chance in court. They made their voices heard, writing letters, pressing officials, and keeping the story alive in the media. Still, prosecutors resisted. Their job was not to appease grief, but to build a case that would hold under the merciless scrutiny of trial law. Then, in the early 1970s, investigators felt a shift. A fresh push was made to prepare the case for prosecution. Detectives began revisiting old interviews, re-examining physical evidence, and reassembling timelines. In 1972, prosecutors seriously considered bringing charges against Scolaro. Files were compiled, testimony lined up. The circumstantial evidence, while imperfect, was extensive. The missing weapons, the financial motive, the lies about his whereabouts, and his increasingly suspicious behavior. There was even handwriting analysis, suggesting he had forged financial records. It seemed finally that the state might move forward, but Scolaro himself was unraveling. By 1973, he was a man cornered by his own life. The weight of suspicion, the collapse of his career, the relentless inquiries from investigators, it all took a toll. He was drinking more, confiding less, and sinking deeper into paranoia. Friends noticed the change. Family members too saw a man whose defenses were wearing thin. In conversations, he hinted at his despair, at the futility of trying to prove his innocence when no one believed. Whether those hints were manipulative deflections or genuine cries of anguish was impossible to say. On March 8, 1973, the story took its most shocking turn. Joseph Scolaro was found dead in his home, the victim of suicide by gunshot. He left behind 2 notes, one to his family, and one addressed more broadly. In those notes, he denied involvement in the Robison family murder. He admitted to financial improprieties, to mistakes that had destroyed his life, but he insisted he had not taken the lives of Richard, Shirley, and their 4 children. His words, written with finality, left investigators and the public with a haunting question. Was this the last act of a guilty man, evading justice, or the despairing protest of an innocent man crushed under suspicion? The suicide devastated the Robison investigation. With Scolaro dead, the possibility of a trial evaporated. Prosecutors lost their only suspect. Detectives lost the chance to confront him one final time. The case, which had hovered so close to resolution, instead dissolved into ambiguity. For the families of the victims, it was another betrayal. They had been robbed, not only of their loved ones, but of the justice they had sought for nearly 5 years. Now that justice was permanently out of reach. In the aftermath, police reviewed the case files and reiterated their belief that Scolaro had been the killer. The circumstantial evidence, they argued, was overwhelming. His suicide, though not a confession, seemed to confirm his inability to withstand the weight of guilt and investigation. Yet officially, the case remained unsolved. Without a conviction, without a definitive link, the murders of the Robison family were left open. The cabin in Good Hart eventually became a macabre landmark. Visitors whispered about the tragedy. Locals avoided the area, or spoke of it in hushed tones. The community never forgot the summer of 1968, when the illusion of safety had been shattered. For law enforcement, the Robison murders remained one of Michigan's darkest mysteries, a case that exemplified the cruel gap between knowing and proving. As the years passed, new investigators would occasionally reopen the files, sifting through old evidence, hoping for something overlooked. Modern forensic techniques held the promise of fresh insight, but the lack of preserved material limited what could be done. Ballistic evidence, without the weapons, remained inconclusive. Handwriting analysis could only reinforce suspicion, not close the case. The same frustrating puzzle pieces sat in the same places, refusing to click together. For those who studied the case, the questions multiplied rather than diminished. Why had the killer used 2 guns? Why had he bludgeoned some victims, instead of relying solely on bullets? Why murder the entire family when silencing Richard alone might have sufficed? Was it simply rage, a desire not only to eliminate a threat, but to annihilate everything connected to him? Or was it a psychological unraveling in the moment, a descent into savagery that even the killer had not anticipated? The suicide of Scolaro left these questions frozen in time. He could no longer answer them, nor could he face cross-examination that might have revealed cracks in his story. In some ways, his death ensured that the mystery would endure forever. The Robison murders were left not with closure but with a void, a story that ended not in a courtroom verdict, but in an unfinished chapter. For the relatives of the Robison family, the pain did not fade. Every year brought reminders, birthdays that never came, holidays that were forever incomplete, milestones that Richard and Shirley's children would never reach. Their grief was compounded by the uncertainty. Even if they believed, as investigators did, that Scolaro had been guilty, the absence of legal judgment left them unsatisfied. They were forced to live with suspicion, denial, and ambiguity rather than the clear finality of justice. The community, too, carried scars. Good Hart's reputation was forever altered. The idyllic image of lakeside cabins and summer peace was stained by the memory of slaughter. For some, it was a cautionary tale about trust, about the darkness that can hide beneath professional respectability. For others, it was simply a reminder of fragility, that safety can be shattered in a single night, and that evil can strike even in the most unlikely places. The Robison murders entered the lore of Michigan crime, studied by journalists, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts for decades to come. Theories abounded, but the narrative always circled back to the same man, Joseph Scolaro. His name became inseparable from the case, his suicide an eerie coda that left just enough room for doubt to keep the story alive. Was he guilty, crushed by the inevitability of justice? Or was he innocent, destroyed by a system that mocked him but could not prove its case? The answer remained elusive, locked away in a past that no investigation could fully illuminate. And so, as the 1970s marched forward, the Robison case drifted officially into cold case status. The files were boxed, the crime scene long since cleaned, the players either dead or scattered. Yet the story never died. Each retelling carried with it the same haunting images: a family slaughtered in their summer cabin, a trusted associate whose greed and desperation may have driven him to the unthinkable, and a trail of evidence that pointed but never confirmed. It was a tragedy without closure, a mystery without an ending, and a wound that never healed. The summer air around Good Hart had begun to shift, as August rolled in, heavy with the sense of finality that came at the end of tourist season. Cabins emptied, roads grew quieter, and the memories of the gruesome murders that had rocked the shoreline still lingered like an infection no one could cure. Investigators were under enormous pressure. Families in the area demanded answers, business owners feared the collapse of the summer economy, and reporters hounded every angle of the case, turning the normally tranquil village into a nest of suspicion and whispered conversation. The sheriff's office, overwhelmed and understaffed, leaned heavily on state investigators who had been combing through the wreckage of the Robison family's life, looking for patterns, enemies, or even the faintest thread that might tie the deaths to someone tangible. The thread that seemed to shine brightest, despite its frayed edges, was Joseph "Joe" Scolaro III. He was 30 years old, balding early, and wore his anxieties on his face even when he tried to cover them with charm. He had been a close associate of Richard Robison in Detroit, working in the advertising and publishing firm that Richard had built. But beneath the professional veneer were growing cracks, financial improprieties, personal resentments, and unspoken rivalry. Investigators pored over the firm's accounts, tracing every dollar that had passed between Richard and Scolaro. They discovered what Richard himself had begun to suspect before his death. Funds had been siphoned away, contracts mishandled, Promises broke. Richard had reportedly been preparing to cut ties with Scolaro, and for a man as proud as Joe, who lived beyond his means and carried debts he could not pay, the prospect of ruin loomed large. But suspicion alone would not secure justice. The detectives needed something solid. They turned their focus to the weapons. Ballistics experts had already determined that the Robison family had been murdered with 2 guns, a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle and a .20. Scolaro, they learned, owned both types of weapons, though he claimed to have sold them or misplaced them before the murders. This convenient explanation did not satisfy the investigators. They questioned him repeatedly, probing for inconsistencies, but he stuck to his story with unnerving calm, always polite, always helpful, yet never quite giving them what they needed. His alibi for the critical days in late June when the murders occurred was shaky at best. He claimed to have been in Detroit, attending to business, visiting his mother, making phone calls, yet phone records, receipts, and witness statements could not reliably anchor him in place. At times he seemed to vanish into gaps of hours, unaccounted for, where his whereabouts were known only to himself. Investigators pieced together a timeline circling the days with red ink, but it remained a puzzle with missing parts. The possibility that Scolaro had driven north, committed the murders, and returned south was feasible. It was a long drive, but not impossible, and with so much at stake for him, the motive gleamed like a sharp blade. Still, the prosecution hesitated. The sheriff's office feared that without the murder weapons or a clear confession, a case against Scolaro could collapse in court. They continued to gather statements from those who knew the Robison. Friends described Richard as ambitious, sometimes abrasive, a man who pushed hard in business, and occasionally rubbed people the wrong way. Shirley was gentler, a peacemaker, the kind of woman who kept family life warm even as her husband burned through long hours of work. Their children, bright and curious, were beloved in their community. None of them had enemies outside the scope of Richard's business world, and that narrowed the field back to Joe once again. Journalists, hungry for a villain, began to dig into his life. They uncovered the debts, the failed ventures, the whispers of betrayal. For Joe, the spotlight was suffocating. He tried to present himself as cooperative, even wounded by the suspicions cast upon him, but behind closed doors his temper fled. Associates noticed his mood swings, the way he snapped when the subject turned to the murders. His wife, trapped in the storm, bore witness to his unraveling but said little publicly. To admit doubt in her husband would have meant acknowledging a horror she could not face. Meanwhile, forensic science in 1968 was far less advanced than it would become decades later. Blood typing was imprecise, fingerprinting required clean impressions, and DNA testing did not exist. Detectives relied on interviews, on intuition, on the painstaking sifting of financial records. They uncovered letters Richard had written hinting at frustration with Scolaro, pointing toward a coming confrontation. Each piece of evidence was circumstantial, yet together they painted a picture investigators could not ignore. Joe had the motive, the means, and perhaps the opportunity. The town of Good Hart, however, had grown weary of waiting. Summer visitors whispered that the sheriff was dragging his feet, afraid of ruining a man's life without certainty. Residents whispered about curses, about the forest swallowing secrets. Others spoke openly of vigilante justice, muttering that if the law could not bring peace, perhaps the community should. It was an atmosphere thick with distrust, every shadow a suspect, every stranger a threat. For Scolaro, paranoia grew. He knew the eyes of the community were upon him. Each article in the Detroit papers etched his name deeper into public suspicion. Each interview with investigators left him more entangled in their web. He tried to maintain the facade of control, but inside he was breaking. He continued to run business ventures, though many faltered. Friends drifted away. The pressure mounted, year after year, as the case remained unsolved but never forgotten. By 1972, investigators revisited the evidence once more. They re-examined ballistics reports, re-interviewed witnesses, and compared timelines. Once again, the guns stood at the center of the storm. Joe had purchased weapons matching those used in the murders, and though he claimed they were gone, no one could confirm it. The prosecutor weighed the possibility of finally bringing charges. Yet without the guns, the risk loomed large. If acquitted, Scolaro could never be tried again. The case would be closed forever, and justice denied. And so, paralysis held them. The file thickened, the evidence circled endlessly, but action never came. For the families of the victims, time did not heal. Richard's business associates whispered about his unfinished projects. Shirley's relatives grieved quietly, holding memories close but avoiding the painful topic in public. The Robison children were mourned in silence, their bright futures extinguished. Each year that passed was another year of unanswered questions, and always, in the shadows of those questions, stood Joe Scolaro, living with the suspicion that clung to him like a second skin. By early 1973, the strain reached its peak. Joe's finances were in disarray, his reputation battered, his future bleak. Investigators had grown more confident privately that he was their man, though publicly, they admitted little. Rumors swirled that charges might soon come. Joe must have known. He must have felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, the noose tightening around his neck even without a rope. He had lived 5 years with suspicion, and it had hollowed him out. One March morning, Joe wrote notes, letters to family, letters to friends, letters to the world he was leaving behind. In them, he denied involvement in the murders. He admitted to sins, to failures, to weaknesses of character, but he maintained his innocence where the Robisons were concerned. Then, alone with his despair, he ended his life with the pull of a trigger. The man who had walked free of charges would never face a courtroom, never be cross-examined, never tell his story under oath. With his death, the chance of justice evaporated like mist on the lake. The shock rippled outward. Some saw his suicide as a confession, a final acknowledgement of guilt. Others saw it as the desperate act of an innocent man, crushed beneath suspicion and shame. The sheriff's office declared the case effectively closed, though never formally solved. To this day, the official record leaves the murders of the Robison family unsolved, though the shadow of Joe Scolaro remains etched across every page. Yet for those who lived through it, for those who walked past the cabin and remembered the flies at the windows, for those who whispered about curses and betrayals, the story never ended. It remained a wound in Michigan's history, a tale of a family slaughtered in their summer retreat, a businessman destroyed by greed and fear, and a community forever haunted by the unanswered question, what truly happened in Good Hart in June of...
After Joseph Scolaro's death in March of 1973, the Robison case seemed to dissolve into the air like smoke, unresolved, yet smothered under the heavy silence of finality. For many in law enforcement, his suicide was as close to a confession as they would ever get. The notes he left behind, though not an admission of murder, were framed by investigators as the desperate writings of a guilty man who could not bear the inevitability of exposure. In the years that followed, the sheriff's office carried on with its work. New crimes replaced old ones, and the files containing the Good Hart massacre were quietly filed away. But for the people who had lived with the aftermath, for the relatives of the Robisons, and for the community that had borne the weight of whispered speculation, the case was never closed. In Good Hart, the scars lingered. The cottage itself, once a summer retreat, filled with the laughter of children and the easy rhythm of vacations, stood as a grim reminder. For years after the murders, the cabin remained unsold, its very existence a grotesque monument to violence. Local children told stories about it, daring one another to get close, whispering that blood still stained the floorboards, that the ghosts of the Robisons still cried inside its walls. Tourists who came to the area sometimes asked locals to point out the murder cabin, a macabre curiosity that brought a chill to the quiet shoreline. Eventually ownership changed hands, and the house was altered, but the stain of its history could never be erased. The Robison relatives, scattered and broken by the loss, did their best to move forward, but the shock of losing 6 family members, Richard and Shirley, along with their 4 children, was an unhealed wound. Cousins, aunts and uncles avoided public interviews, preferring privacy over constant reminders. Some of them expressed quiet anger at the authorities for never bringing the case to trial. Others privately accepted the idea that Scolaro was guilty, and that his suicide was a coward's way of avoiding punishment. Still, no one could ever be entirely certain, and in that uncertainty lay a particular torment. In Detroit, where Richard had built his business, and where Joe Scolaro had tried to fashion himself as a rising figure in advertising. The case lived on as a cautionary tale. Colleagues remembered Richard as a demanding employer, sometimes arrogant, often shrewd, but ultimately dedicated to his family. They remembered Joe as a man of ambition, who lived on borrowed money and borrowed confidence, always reaching beyond his grasp. Their tangled relationship was now forever frozen in the shadow of tragedy, a story of betrayal and suspicion that students of crime and psychology would analyze for decades. As the years turned into decades, the Robison murders never quite faded from public memory. True crime magazines in the 1970s and 1980s retold the story in lurid detail, emphasizing the eerie setting of the northern Michigan woods, the isolation of the cabin, the sudden obliteration of a family. Journalists sought out the old investigators, asking them what they believed had happened. Nearly all of them pointed to Scolaro. They cited his financial troubles, his missing guns, his shaky alibi, and above all the fact that his suicide had cut short any chance of trial. But without a conviction, the case remained in the liminal space of unsolved, a category that invites endless speculation. By the 1990s, as true crime television began to capture audiences with dramatizations and documentaries, the Robison family murders resurfaced in new format. Programs aired reenactments of the case, complete with ominous narration, dramatized gunfire, and actors portraying Richard, Shirley, and their children in their final hours. These productions often ended the same way, with a question left hanging in the air. Was Joseph Scolaro truly the killer, or was he merely a convenient suspect whose troubled life made him an easy target? If not him, then who? Theories sprouted in the absence of absolute proof. Some speculated about mob connections, pointing to Richard's business ventures and the possibility that he had crossed the wrong people in Detroit. Others suggested a personal vendetta, someone else with a grudge, perhaps even a family friend or another associate who had never been properly investigated. The fact that two weapons had been used suggested either extraordinary planning or more than one perpetrator. Could Joe have acted alone, or had he been helped by someone else, someone who never came under suspicion? The uncertainty kept the case alive in the minds of amateur detectives and historians alike. For the town of Good Hart, the murders became a permanent part of local law. Residents learned to live with the association, but the name of their village was forever linked to violence. For outsiders, Good Hart conjured not peace, but blood. Visitors often asked about the story, and locals offered only careful answers, weary of being defined by something so dark. Yet even as people tried to look away, the case exerted a gravitational pull, drawing the curious back to the cabin, to the shoreline, to the mystery. The progression of forensic science in the late 20th century reignited faint hopes among some that the case might someday be revisited. DNA testing, advanced ballistics, and computer databases offered tools investigators in 1968 could not have imagined, but by then, much of the physical evidence had degraded or been lost. The guns were never recovered. Clothing and biological samples, if they existed, were stored in outdated conditions or discarded. Without the physical anchors of modern science, the Robison case remained beyond the reach of definitive proof. For historians of crime, the story holds a unique place. It reflects the tension of the late 1960s, when America was already fractured by social upheaval, distrust in institutions, and a rising fascination with violent crime. It captures the failure of law enforcement systems, not yet equipped with the scientific tools of later decades, and it speaks to the human dimensions of tragedy, greed, betrayal, the fragility of trust, and the devastation left in the wake of violence. In more recent years, authors and journalists have returned to the case with renewed vigor. Books have been written, each retelling the story with slightly different emphasis, some treating Scolaro as definitively guilty, others leaving room for doubt. Podcasts,
in the age of digital media, have dissected every known detail, giving voice to new generations of listeners who had never heard of the Robisons before. The power of the story remains. An entire family destroyed in their summer retreat, the mystery lingering, the suspect dead, the justice incomplete. The Robison children in particular remain a haunting element of the tragedy. David, 19 years old, had been on the cusp of adulthood. Susie was 16, Randall 12, and little Richie just 7. Their lives had barely begun, yet they were cut short in a storm of bullets. For many who study the case, it is this detail, more than any theory of motive or method, that leaves the deepest mark. An entire future was erased. The laughter of children that once filled the cabin was silenced forever, replaced by the echoes of gunfire and the endless hum of speculation. When visitors today travel to Emmett County, the beauty of northern Michigan greets them. The rolling woods, the serene waters of Lake Michigan, the quiet roads that wind through Good Hart. For those who know the story, however, that beauty is layered with darkness. To walk the shoreline is to walk among ghosts. To see the cabins tucked into the trees is to imagine the Robisons on their last evening, unaware of what was coming. To stand in Good Hart is to stand at the intersection of innocence and violence, peace and horror. And still, the question endures. If Joseph Scolaro was indeed the killer, then the story is one of greed and betrayal, of a man driven by desperation to slaughter an entire family, to cover his failures. If he was not, then the true killer has never been named, never been brought to justice, never been held accountable. That uncertainty keeps the case alive decades after the fact, drawing researchers, writers, and the curious back again and again. For those closest to it, however, the case is not simply a puzzle, it is a loss that cannot be undone. For them, the story is not about theories, but about lives. Richard and Shirley, their children, the summer that should have been filled with joy but ended in blood. The files may gather dust, the theories may multiply, but for the families left behind, the Robison murders are not history. They are a wound, still aching, never healed. Even now, nearly 6 decades later, the story refuses to die. It circulates in true crime forums, appears in documentaries, and whispers through Michigan's folklore. Good Hart remains beautiful, but haunting. The Robison family remains gone, but remembered, and the name of Joseph Scolaro remains etched in infamy, suspended forever between guilt and doubt. The truth of what happened in June of 1968 lies buried with the dead, locked away in silence, beyond the reach of courts or journalists or historian. All that remains is the mystery, and the echo of unanswered questions carried on the northern winds. And so, the story of the Robison family remains frozen in time, a tragedy that turned a summer retreat into a crime scene, and left behind questions that no one has ever been able to answer. The lives of Richard, Shirley, and their children were cut short in a way that still chills those who hear about it today, their laughter silenced by violence that seems almost impossible to comprehend. Decades have passed, suspects have been named and theories spun, yet the truth remains just beyond reach. Justice never came, and perhaps it never will, but the memory of the Robisons lingers like an unfinished sentence, reminding us that behind every headline is a family, behind every mystery, a wound that never fully healed. The case is no longer just about who pulled the trigger. It is about the haunting silence left in the wake of lives stolen, and the questions that echo across generations, refusing to fade.